New Orleans, 1847, a city of music, money, and misery. The Bogard plantation just beyond the city's edge was a monument to Creole wealth. Acres of sugarcane waving under the punishing Louisiana sun, a stately mansion filled with imported finery, and a family whose name carried weight in parlors and political chambers alike. But behind the polished silver and polished manners lay a foundation of cruelty, secrecy, and blood. And on one October evening, the very structure of that house, its lineage, its legacy, its life, would be dismantled by one quiet woman whose suffering had been ignored too long. Her name was Violet. For 10 years she had been the heart of the Bogard kitchen, the one whose hands turned raw ingredients into art, whose skill turned every dinner into a social triumph. Guests praised the family's refinement, never suspecting the true source of their delight stood behind them, silent and enslaved. Violet was known for her grace, her calm, and her uncanny ability to remember every guest's preference, every allergy, every delicate palate. It was a gift, and eventually it would become a weapon. The breaking point came months earlier, after an incident no one outside the mansion ever fully understood. Punishment was common, cruel discipline a fact of plantation life. But what Violet endured was different. For days she was starved and beaten, a quiet, methodical humiliation designed not just to hurt her body, but to extinguish her spirit. It did not succeed. Instead, it created something far more dangerous. A woman who had nothing left to lose, and a mind sharp enough to calculate revenge with surgical precision. By October, the Bogards were riding high. Their sugar yields were excellent, debts were clearing, and the season's grand dinner, a sprawling affair meant to cement their renewed place in New Orleans' upper echelon, was set for the 23rd. Invitations went out to judges, bankers, even the city's mayor. For Octave Bogard, the patriarch, this was not merely a dinner, it was a declaration that the family's future was bright. For Violet, it would be the perfect night to end them all. The morning of the dinner began like any other, at least on the surface. The household stirred before sunrise, linens were pressed, flowers cut, silver polished, the children were fitted for their best clothes. The old matriarch laid out her jewels, but in the kitchen something was different. Violet worked alone on key elements of the meal, refusing help with sauces and seasonings. To the butler, old Moses, it looked like simple pride. To Violet it was necessary isolation. Each ingredient had to be exact, each dish, a link in a deadly chain. She had spent weeks observing, memorizing not just tastes, but tolerances, who preferred heavier portions, who drank more wine, whose constitution ran delicate, whose appetite was robust. The meal had to unfold like theater, slow, elegant, unremarkable, until the final act. The poisons themselves were drawn from plants, herbs, and household substances, each harmless in small amounts but catastrophic in combination. Her brilliance lay not in the ingredients but in the timing. No single dish would kill, but together, over hours, they would destroy every organ, leaving doctors bewildered and families ruined. By 6 o'clock the mansion glittered with candlelight, the parlor filled with laughter, cigars, gossip about politics and Paris fashion. Glasses clinked, fortunes were quietly negotiated between sips of brandy, and in the kitchen doorway, Violet watched, not with joy nor with fear, but with a cold, hollow calm. Every face in that room represented years of silent complicity, every guest a pillar of a system that devoured people like her and called it order. At the sound of Moses's formal announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, supper is served," the party flowed into the dining room, never guessing they were walking into their own execution. The meal was a triumph. Turtle soup opened the night, rich and delicately spiced. Praise came instantly. The pompano with citrus sauce nearly brought one guest to tears of delight. Wines paired perfectly. Chatter grew lively. Cheeks flushed. Even the critical grandmother nodded approval between bites of tender beef. Violet's hands, unseen but remembered in every compliment, were being celebrated in real time by those they were destroying. The first signs were so small they seemed meaningless. A tightening in the throat here, a faint cramp there, a judge pausing mid-story to take a long sip of water, blaming the heat, the banker dabbing at sudden sweat with his napkin, laughing it off. Even the mayor flushed, and a little dizzy, assumed the imported claret was stronger than expected. By dessert, a praline bread pudding so flawless, it silenced the table in reverent awe. The damage was irreversible. The final element of Violet's mixture, hidden in the custard, bound the other compounds together like a fuse hitting powder. Minutes later, the first collapse came, the elderly matriarch falling sideways in her chair, glass shattering as her body hit the polished floor. Then a child, vomiting blood, her white dress stained beyond recognition. Within 15 minutes, the grandest dining room in New Orleans had become a scene of screaming, choking, clawing horror. Dr. Thibodeau, himself a guest, tried desperately to assist, but his own muscles were seizing, his vision blurring. He realized with growing dread that this was no illness, this was war, fought quietly, invisibly from within. He ordered Moses to summon help, but even as he spoke he knew no doctor, no priest, no army could arrive in time. Death was already in motion. In the kitchen, Violet stood listening. No shouting now, just moans, choking sobs, and then silence. Samuel, the man she loved, found her there, tears streaking her cheeks, though her face remained like stone. "What have you done?" he whispered. "I served them exactly what they served me," she said, her voice steady. "Nothing more, nothing less." By midnight, 13 members of the Bogard household were dead. The few guests who survived, including Dr. Thibodeau, by chance, or by biology, lied to authorities, citing sudden fever. Public scandal would ruin them all. Official records called it an act of God, a plague-like mystery. But among the enslaved, and in whispers through New Orleans parlors, the truth spread like smoke. The Bogards had been poisoned, not by an enemy army, not by a rival plantation, but by the quiet hands that had once fed them. The aftermath was as brutal as it was inevitable. The plantation was seized, sold for pennies on the dollar. The enslaved families were torn apart, scattered to creditors like livestock. Samuel lived 2 years longer, dying in what some called an accident and others called despair. Violet herself vanished. Some claimed she escaped north. Others believed she was sold under a false name. A persistent legend said she remained in New Orleans, cooking for the poor in the French Quarter, feeding those the world had forgotten, redeeming, in her own way, the very gift she had once turned into a weapon. The mansion never recovered. New owners reported illness at dinner parties. Servants saw a woman in a faded head wrap standing at the stove before dawn. Soldiers quartered there during the Civil War wrote of untraceable sickness sweeping through the wounded. By the 1880s, it was called cursed. By the 1890s, demolished. Today, a park sits on that soil, and sometimes just before sunrise, locals claim to smell caramel and roasted fish, as if a kitchen long gone still lingers in the morning mist. But Violet's true legacy is not in ghost story. It lies in the lesson her tragedy carved into the marrow of history, that no system of cruelty lasts forever, and that sometimes justice comes not from courts or gods, but from the hands of the broken, striking back with the tools they were forced to master. What do you think? Was Violet a monster, or was she a mirror, reflecting a monstrous world back upon itself? Could her plan have truly been carried out so flawlessly, or has time polished a bloody night into a legend too perfect to doubt? History often forgets names like Violet, but stories like hers, they never truly die. It began as most tragedies do, not with an explosion but with a quiet accumulation of cruelty. Life in the Bogard household was a performance, a daily theater of wealth, civility, and brutal contradiction. The city saw refinement, white gloves, polished carriages, French tutors for the children. Inside, the walls held secrets the gas lamps could never burn clean. The Bogards had made their fortune on sugar and human suffering, like so many Creole dynasties of the day. Octave Bogard was considered enlightened by his peers, which meant only that he preferred elegance over overt brutality. He did not whip, he delegated. He did not rage, he commanded. To the city's elite, that restraint read as nobility. To those who served under his roof, it was work. Rage was at least honest. Octave's cruelty came in polite words, in smiles that ordered starvation, in punishments dressed as etiquette. Violet had been brought into this world at 17, sold off from a smaller plantation to settle a debt. From the moment she arrived, Octave recognized her gift. She could cook anything, not just well but with a precision that bordered on artistry. It was not long before she was installed as head of the kitchen, a rare post for a woman so young, rarer still for someone recently purchased. But talent in the Bogard house was a tool to be exploited, not rewarded. For years Violet kept her head down. She worked in silence, saved the scraps she could for Samuel, a field hand with whom she shared the kind of quiet, aching tenderness forbidden by law and by cruelty alike. They would meet at night, behind the tool sheds, or in the far cane rows, hands brushing in the dark like two souls begging the world not to crush what little they'd found. But secrets have gravity, and on the night that would change everything, Samuel was caught leaving her quarters, not by a rival, not by a patrol, but by Madame Eloise Bogard herself. Eloise was not known for her temper, but she was known for her pride. To her, the kitchen was a sacred extension of her social power. The idea that her chef, her property, had been compromised by an unsanctioned romance was not just distasteful, it was humiliating. It was, in her eyes, a betrayal, and betrayal had to be punished. The punishment was cruel not in scale but in design. Violet was neither beaten to death, nor sold off. Instead, she was humiliated systematically. Meals were withheld, water rationed, work doubled, rumors whispered into the children's ears to turn them cold toward her. Eloise would smile, sweet and poisonous, while quietly removing every thread of dignity. Violet had left, and Samuel, her only light, was chained, loaned out to another plantation for months at a time, just far enough that she could never know if he was dead or merely suffering. It worked for a while. Violet grew thin, pale, quieter still, but when Samuel returned, bruised but breathing, the hollow space inside her filled not with relief, but with clarity. The house she served would never stop consuming her. There would be no mercy, no gradual softening, no luck, no freedom bought in a will or a letter from the city. Her life, her love, her very self, had been ground down into a tool, and tools eventually break. She did not weep, she planned. The first step was observation. Violet began to study, not just ingredients but habits. Who ate the most, who drank quickly, who sent plates back half finished, who took second helpings when no one was looking. She memorized tolerances, which meats sat heavy on which stomachs, whose bowels were delicate, whose nerves were quick to flutter. She kept this knowledge like a ledger in her mind, a quiet arithmetic of appetite and vulnerability. The second step was preparation. A kitchen slave in the 1840s had access to more than food: cleaning agents, garden herbs, mineral powders for polishing silver, all benign on their own, all potentially lethal in cunning hands. Violet began experimenting in microscopic doses, folded invisibly into sauces and wines, not to harm but to test. Did the bitterness show? Did the smell change? Could a texture give her away? Each test became another invisible stitch in a garment of death. No one could see her sewing. And all the while, the Bogards celebrated their good fortune. Eloise bragged about her dinners, about the brilliance of her cook, never guessing that every compliment was another nail in the coffin being built beneath her own roof. But revenge, like hunger, is never clean. As Violet plotted, doubt gnawed at her, not doubt of execution. She knew her skill, she trusted her precision, but of aftermath, would they blame her? Would Samuel be killed in retaliation? Could she even live with herself afterward? It was Samuel who answered her without ever knowing. One night, weeks before the dinner, they sat together in the darkness, his body still aching from field work, her hands raw from kitchen fires. He whispered, "One day, this all ends. It always ends. Just not for us." That was the moment the last thread of hesitation burned away. If the world would never deliver justice, then she would, and she would do it with the very thing they had loved most about her, her gift. The Bogards set the date for their grand seasonal dinner, October, a night meant to display their wealth, charm and power, an offering to the city's elite, a gathering of judges, merchants, bankers and kin. Every name on the guest list was a name tied to the old order, the order that fed itself on people like her, and called it providence. To them, it would be a feast. To Violet it would be a reckoning. In the days leading up to the event, she moved like a ghost through the kitchen, calm, efficient, impossible to read. The other servants saw nothing strange. To them, this was just another dinner, albeit a large one. But behind Violet's quiet eyes, a storm was tightening. Measurements were double-checked, wines quietly swapped, soups simmered not just with stock and herbs, but with carefully timed doses that would lie dormant until the body's chemistry woke them hours later. She even considered, in fleeting moments, stopping, leaving the city, disappearing upriver, with Samuel,
escaping before her courage turned to catastrophe. But then she'd see Eloise laughing in the parlor, see Octave signing another contract that would chain more bodies to his fields, see children being taught that cruelty was inheritance, and she would return to her calculations, steady as ever. And yet, even in her cold resolve, something fragile remained. On the night before the dinner, as she folded linens for the table, she paused, alone in the still room, and whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, not for mercy, but for silence, that if any God was listening, they would look away, neither stopping her nor condemning her, just letting the night unfold without cosmic interference. Justice, she decided, was not heaven's to give. It would be human, bloody, imperfect, final. The stage was set, the kitchen polished, the wines cooled, the house hummed with anticipation. No one, not a guest, not a servant, not even Samuel, knew that the most important meal in New Orleans that season would be its last for an entire family line. The poison had already been chosen, the doses measured, the plan irreversible.
And Violet, the quiet cook, the invisible architect of countless parties, had become something new. Not a servant, not a victim, but a weapon disguised as grace. The morning of October 23rd dawned clear and cool, with a breeze coming off the Mississippi that carried just enough sweetness to make the city forget, for a moment, the rot beneath its elegance. At the Bogard mansion, preparations began at sunrise. Servants polished silver until their knuckles bled. Crystal glasses gleamed like frozen water. Fresh flowers arrived from a plantation upriver, their scent mingling with the spice of roasting meats and simmering sauces. The house was a cathedral to excess, a temple of wealth built on bones. From the outside, nothing looked amiss. The carriages that lined the gravel drive later that day brought New Orleans' finest, judges in stiff collars, merchants with bellies stretched by profits, distant cousins draped in European silks. Every guest carried a name that meant something in the city: wealth, power, reputation. They arrived laughing, gossiping, congratulating themselves for knowing the right people. It was the same ritual played out 100 times before. No one noticed that the air itself seemed to hold its breath. In the kitchen, Violet worked with the focus of a surgeon. Every dish was a calculation. Timing mattered. Some substances needed heat to activate, others needed to remain cool. Some would work within hours, others were slow, silent, subtle. Each plate, each cup, each delicate pastry was part of a pattern only she could see. It was not random, it was choreography. She checked the clock, a brass-faced heirloom imported from France, its ticking the mansion's heartbeat, and noted with clinical calm how quickly her own hands had stopped trembling. The fear that had stalked her for weeks was gone. In its place was something colder, purpose. The dinner began just after 7. The long mahogany table groaned under the weight of roasted duck, oysters dressed in cream, candied pecans, turtle soup rich enough to make lesser men dizzy. Guests raised glasses of claret imported at obscene cost, unaware that each toast brought them closer to a grave. Conversations floated above the table like perfume: politics, sugar prices, theater gossip, a newly arrived pianist from Paris, rumors of a war with Mexico, whether abolitionist pamphlets should be burned or merely banned. Laughter cracked like kindling. Octave Bogard presided over it all, a man at ease in his empire. Eloise sat poised beside him, a queen without a crown, her every glance a signal to servants who moved like shadows. To any observer the night was perfect. To Violet, it was a map, one where every smile, every swallow, every forkful marked the progress of justice taking root in human flesh. Samuel, against Violet's instructions, had stayed. He kept to the periphery of the service, refilling glasses, carrying platters, pretending to be invisible. But every so often their eyes met, a fleeting glance across a room filled with people who had no idea they were sharing their last meal. In those moments he saw not cruelty in her gaze, but finality. Whatever was coming, there was no turning it back. Around 8:30, the first signs appeared, subtle enough to be dismissed. A guest dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, muttering about the heat. A cousin laughed a little too loud, then complained of a sour stomach. A young woman paused mid-sentence, as if she'd lost her thought, and took a long sip of wine. Eloise herself leaned back, fanning delicately, whispering to Octave that perhaps the oysters had been too rich this season, but by 9, murmurs had become grown. Chairs scraped against polished wood as diners shifted, uncomfortable. A second course, barely touched, cooled on porcelain plates. Conversation faltered. A hush spread like a shadow over the table. Someone coughed, not politely but violently, as though their throat were rebelling. Another stood too quickly, sending a wineglass shattering to the floor, then clutched at their stomach, pale and trembling. Dr. Thibodeau, a family friend seated near the center, rose with professional alarm. At first he assumed food poisoning, a bad fish spoiled cream. But when 3 people exhibited entirely different symptoms simultaneously, one dizzy, one vomiting, one unable to catch their breath, his mind leapt somewhere darker. He barked orders for windows to be opened, for cool cloths, for calm, always calm, even as his own gut began to churn. And through it all, Violet continued to serve, her movements smooth, unhurried. She poured water for the fainting, fetched cloths for the sweating, offered calm words that no one had ever bothered to offer her. To the casual eye, she was simply doing her duty. Only Samuel saw the truth. She was conducting the last act of a play that had been rehearsed in silence for weeks. The collapse was inevitable now. What had begun as discomfort became agony. Skin flushed, then ashen. Breaths came shallow, irregular. The grand dining room, built to impress, now stank of vomit, fear, and the sharp metallic tang of bodies failing. Eloise tried to rise, but her legs betrayed her. Octave, the man who never raised his voice, screamed, a guttural, panicked sound, raw enough to strip the varnish from the myth of his control. Servants fled, guests crawled, silver crashed to the floor. The house that had symbolized order was now a theater of chaos, and still Violet remained calm. In the kitchen, Samuel found her at last, standing by the hearth, staring into the low, steady fire. He reached for her, words dying on his tongue. All he managed was a whisper. Her eyes flicked toward him, not cruel, not soft, simply empty of anything left to give. It had to be, she said. Her voice carried no triumph, no regret, only truth spoken aloud for the first time. They took everything. Tonight, I took it back. Behind them, the screams faded into moans, then silence, then nothing at all. The Bogard line, 13 souls who had believed themselves untouchable, lay scattered across the very table where they had toasted their wealth an hour before. Outside, the city slept on, unaware that one of its great houses had just fallen, not to bankruptcy, not to scandal, but to the quiet, deliberate rage of a woman the law would never acknowledge as human. By midnight, the mansion was only the ticking of the brass clock marked the passage of time. Samuel wept quietly in the corner. Violet sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes fixed on a spot only she could see. Whatever future waited, whether a gallows, a fugitive's road, or a legend whispered in markets and kitchens for generations, the night itself was done. Justice, if that's what it could be called, had been served. By dawn, the Bogard mansion had become a mausoleum, wearing the mask of a home. No carriages stood in the drive. The lamps in the street gutters still flickered. Inside, the grand dining room sat as it had been left. Chairs tipped, linen stiff with vomit and wine, the air heavy with the sweet sour reek of death. The servants, those who had not fled in terror during the night, stood in small clusters along the hallways, whispering prayers in French, English, Creole. Not a soul dared touch the bodies. Dr. Thibodeau, alone, still moved, though every step was taken through a fog of exhaustion and disbelief. His own stomach still roiled with dull, persistent pain. Whether from poison or horror he could not say. He had spent the night with quill and ledger, recording names, times, symptoms, out of instinct more than hope. Medicine, he knew, was powerless now, but order, even the order of ink, was a shield against madness. By mid-morning, word had spread, carried by a servant who had run barefoot to the nearest parish house. City officials arrived with hastily covered mouths, constables behind them, eyes wide. They stood at the threshold, taking in the carnage of one of New Orleans' oldest dynasties, without daring to cross into the dining room, until Dr. Thibodeau waved them in. He spoke low, clipped, authoritative, a tone that masked the true fever, he told them, as though the word itself could bind reality. A sudden fever, violent,
Unpredictable, you must list it as. When one young constable opened his mouth to protest, to ask about the froth, the discoloration, the sharp smell clinging to the air, Thibodeau silenced him with a stare carved from grief and professional gravity. "You will write what I say," he repeated, "or you will unleash panic this city cannot contain." And so it was done. Death certificates, fever of unknown origin, burial orders signed, bodies transported discreetly, coffins closed without public viewing. By the second night, 12 fresh graves were dug in the family plot. The 13th, a child's, was marked only by a small iron cross. The city newspapers carried a single column on page 4. Sudden sickness claims Bogard family. No scandal, no inquiry. New Orleans moved on, or pretended to. For the enslaved there was no pretending. The death of an entire household was not a tragedy alone. It was an accounting. The bank would seize property. Estates would be liquidated. Families would be split like kind. Within 2 weeks, creditors began arriving with ledgers in hand, calculating loss against land, crop and flesh. Men like Moses, whose entire adult life had been bound to the Bogards, found themselves inspected like livestock by buyers, whose only concern was output per season. Violet, astonishingly, remained. For 3 days after the poisoning, she cooked small meals for the remaining staff, cleaned what she could, answered questions with the same steady silence she had worn the night of the feast. To most, she looked like a woman stunned into obedience by trauma. Only Samuel knew better. He stayed close, though he spoke little. What was there to say when love and grief and awe had become indistinguishable? On the 4th night, she was gone. No forced entry, no signs of flight. Her pallet lay neatly folded. The garments she owned, few and worn, were missing. The next morning, a rumor bloomed like mold. Violet had been sold overnight, purchased quietly by a sugar baron from St. Martin Parish. Another claimed she had been arrested in secret, awaiting execution in a jail whose records would never see daylight. Yet a third version, whispered only among those who had served beside her, carried a shiver, that she had simply walked out the back gate, crossed the levee, and vanished into the city, carrying nothing but her skill and her silence. Samuel lasted a fortnight longer. His sale to a cotton plantation upriver was conducted without ceremony. Those who saw him loaded onto the flatboat swore he carried the look of a man already half dead, not beaten, not sick, simply emptied of the will to resist the current of fate. 2 years later, his body was pulled from beneath a collapsed gin wheel, ribs crushed, neck broken. Whether accident or intention, no one asked. For Dr. Thibodeau's survival became its own penance. His appetite never fully returned. Every meal tasted faintly of He kept his notes hidden, locked in a small chest beneath floorboards, adding to them in the months that followed, diagrams of symptoms, chemical speculations, moral confessions written like prayers. His descendants would find them more than a century later, brittle but legible, a record of a night that official history had tried to swallow whole. The mansion itself passed like a cursed coin from hand to hand. Creditors auctioned it. A merchant from Philadelphia bought it, then sold it 6 months later, after his wife suffered a lingering sickness of the nerves that he could not explain. During the war, Union officers quartered there. 3 reported sudden violent vomiting during a single evening meal, prompting whispers of sabotage that no investigation confirmed. By 1887, the house had acquired a reputation unspoken but deeply felt. Servants quit without note. Tenants refused to sleep in rooms that breathed wrong. Eventually, a preservation society purchased it, intending to convert it into a museum of antebellum architecture. 2 years and 4 unexplained injuries later, they abandoned the project. In 1894, the mansion was demolished. The kitchen walls, reportedly untouched by rot, were the last to fall, yet even demolition did not quiet the murmurs. The lot became a park, modest, forgettable by design, but the stories clung like ivy. Children dared one another to cross it at night. Lovers claimed to smell roasting meat where no vendor stood. Groundskeepers told of a woman in a pale head wrap standing motionless at dawn near the fountain, hands folded as if waiting for a table that would never be set. Modern researchers, those who chase the liminal space between history and haunting, argue still over what precisely Violet accomplished. Was it murder, pure and simple? Was it justice rendered in the only coin left to, or was it something worse? A wound so deep it tore a hole in the fabric between the living and the dead, leaving a city forever haunted, not by a ghost but by the echo of its own crime. What remains beyond argument is this: 13 powerful people died, not by chance, nor by providence, but by the quiet, meticulous agency of someone they had believed powerless. And New Orleans, that grand, corrupt, glittering city, kept her secret, because to speak it aloud would have meant confessing more than a crime. It would have meant confessing a truth the city itself was built to deny, that even the most gilded systems of control are fragile when measured against the steady, unyielding will of a human being pushed too far. The clock that had ticked through that October night survived. It sits now in a glass case in a private collection, its brass face polished, its mechanism still functional. Collectors call it elegant, historians call it rare, but the family who owns it swears it stops precisely, inexplicably at 9:07 every October 20th, the hour when the first guest at the Bogard feast dabbed sweat from his brow and muttered, almost casually, that perhaps the oysters had turned. It is a strange thing, how truth refuses to die even when deliberately buried. For years the Bogard massacre, if it could be called that in polite company, was spoken of only in kitchen corners, never in drawing rooms. The city's newspapers had recorded a fever, the coroner's ledgers aligned neatly, yet the files never sat quite right in the archive. In 1862, 21 years after the night in question, a clerk at Charity Hospital, a young man with ambitions toward forensic medicine, noticed a discrepancy. Reviewing records on fevers of unknown origin, he found that none of the usual markers were present in the Bogard cases. No hemorrhage. The progression had been too fast, too synchronized. Even cholera, rampant in the city in those years, staggered its victims in hours and days, not minutes. He wrote a note in the margin. Pattern suggests poisoning, possibly deliberate. Further inquiry advised. The note somehow survived the war. The Union's occupation of New Orleans had gutted more than households. It had burned courthouses, destroyed property deeds, displaced records. Yet this one marginalia, written in a thin, precise hand, unsigned, endured, as if the paper itself understood that it carried something stubborn, dangerous and true. By 1873, medical science had begun to stretch its limbs. Chemists in Europe could isolate compounds invisible to the eye. The concept of toxicology entered polite vocabulary. Dr. Armand Brosseau, a Creole physician with a taste for notoriety, began revisiting old cases, seeking those whose patterns hinted at misdiagnosis. The Bogard file reached his desk like a wisp. Brosseau was not a careful man, but he was a brilliant one. He obtained hair clippings, 2 locks preserved in mourning brooches, worn by distant cousins. He dissolved, distilled, and tested them with the crude reagents of the air. What he found astonished him. Traces of arsenic, faint, degraded, but unmistakable. In a lecture delivered privately to the Société Médicale de la Nouvelle-Orléans, Brosseau presented his findings with theatrical calm. 13 deaths, simultaneous onset, uniform progression, all tied to a single evening meal. No fever, he told the room, ever worked with such symmetry. His conclusion, delivered in a voice like a priest announcing judgment: mass poisoning. The audience shifted in their chair. Some smiled thinly, eager for scandal disguised as science. Others grew pale, knowing precisely what such a revelation implied. Not merely murder, but an undermining of the social hierarchy itself. Within a week, Brosseau's notes were seized under the guise of further verification. They were never returned. His findings were neither confirmed nor refuted. In their place, polite society doubled down on the fever story. Any public mention of poisoning was greeted with laughter, or silence, or threats thinly veiled in etiquette. Yet the paper trail thickened in shadow. State ledgers, now unsealed for probate decades later, revealed irregularities. Certain pieces of silverware, the soup spoons, the serving ladle, were missing from the auction inventory. A kitchen register, handwritten by a steward who could neither read nor write fully, bore a curious entry, dated October 22nd, 1841. New spices, bitter almond, white powder, from apothecary, not usual merchant. Neither item appeared in household accounts before or after.
Then there were the manumission papers that never reached the courthouse. A folded document, unsigned but witnessed, granting freedom to one Violet for services rendered beyond duty. The language was cryptic, legal yet laden with implication. It had been tucked between the pages of a gardening almanac, kept by the eldest Bogard's son. Why he had hidden it, whether he had intended to file it or burn it, no one could say. From these fragments, a picture began to form, not in newspapers or official histories, but in the hushed traffic of letters, academic theses, and late-night conversations in university libraries. By 1901, an anonymous pamphlet circulated in New Orleans under the title The Poison Feast. It presented the Bogard tragedy not as an act of divine misfortune, but as a meticulously orchestrated rebellion, one carried out not with knives or pistols, but with copper pots and a steady hand. The pamphlet named no name. It spoke only of a woman in servitude and a man whose heart burned with loyalty to both her and the unborn. It described a dinner where each course was prepared with precision, each swallow bringing its victim closer to judgment. It suggested that the poison had been tested weeks in advance, administered in doses to stray animals near the property, until the method was perfected. No proof accompanied the claim, but the cadence, clinical, steady, restrained, lent them the weight of something not imagined but remembered. In 1917, Tulane University acquired the Thibodeau papers from a descendant too impoverished to care about reputation. There, in a locked archive, sat the ledger, symptoms charted minute by minute, a small vial corked with wax, its contents a chalky residue labeled only with the initials A.T. The vial was later tested in The result, arsenic trioxide, stable, lethal, undiminished by time. The university chose discretion. The papers were filed under restricted access. Officially, they were of interest to scholars of early Louisiana medicine. Unofficially, they were treated like a family curse, something to be acknowledged but never invoked. Even now, researchers who request access must sign a waiver acknowledging the sensitive nature of certain case materials. Those who do are often struck not by the science, but by the humanity. The ledger's final entry is not medical at all. It reads simply, at 9:03, the house grew silent. At 9:47, Samuel wept. At 10:10, she washed her hands. 3 sentences, no flourish, no justification, just the record of a night that would echo through centuries like a heartbeat in a locked room. The park that replaced the mansion has no plaque. Children run across it, dogs chase thrown sticks, couples picnic there on temperate days, but beneath the sod lie foundations, stones that once held kitchens, cellars, and the memory of 13 final meals. And some nights when the mist comes off the river and settles low, visitors swear they can smell almonds on the air, sweet, bitter, impossible. The more the years stretched between that night in 1841 and the living present, the more the tragedy behaved like a wound that refused to close. Every generation picked at it, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of guilt. The city pretended it was just another entry in its long catalogue of misfortunes: yellow fever, floods, fires, uprisings. But the records never aligned neatly with the excuses. There were too many neat timings, too many sealed documents, too many names whose descendants refused to speak at all. By 1939, a wave of historical medicine had taken hold across the country. Universities sent bright young scholars combing through old death registers, hunting patterns with the zeal of detectives. One such scholar, Josephine Lemoyne, a New Orleans native with a doctor's eye and a poet's patience, found herself assigned to the city's antebellum fever. Her first week in the archive turned up the usual suspects: cholera spikes, malarial blooms, heat strokes called by gentler names, and then the Bogard file. The ledger was dry, clinical, dated in a hand far older than her parents', yet its rhythm stopped her breath. 13 patients, identical onset, progression measured in minutes not hours, vomiting, tremors, cardiac collapse. No record of fevers before or after in the neighborhood. No mention of contagion control. Nothing, in short, that belonged to any fever known to the 19th century. Josephine did what the others had only whispered. She cross-referenced burial permits with property transfers. She followed kitchen staff names into bills of sale. She read depositions filed during estate division disputes, and there, like a blood stain through thin paper, she found Violet again. Sometimes Viola, sometimes V. A purchase dated a disappearance logged in early 1842 with no corresponding sale. A legal motion, curious, coded, referring to freedom enacted under confidential circumstances. By midsummer, Josephine's notes filled 3 binders. She had mapped every guest at the final dinner, reconstructed seating, traced the menu down to ingredients available that season. In a private letter to a friend in Boston, she wrote, "It is no longer a question of if this was poison, but of why and how long it had been in preparation. I believe, God forgive me that the lady and gentleman in question treated the kitchen as a laboratory, one hidden in plain sight, and that every dish served that night was a separate experiment converging at the same dreadful hour. Her phrasing was careful. She never wrote the name. She did not dare, but the implication burned through anyway. Deliberate, systematic, cold as steel, not rage, calculation. By 1942, war had pulled her into other duties. The project went dormant. Her binders, however, didn't. They ended up in Tulane's special collections, unprocessed, tagged only Lemoine Research Notes, 19th Fevers. They sat untouched for decades. It was in 1978 that another scholar, Dr. Henry Caldwell, stumbled across them while researching Creole dietary custom. He described the moment later, over bourbon, to a colleague. I thought I was reading a recipe book until the page turned, and suddenly I'm looking at the chemical structure of arsenic trioxide scrawled in fountain pen. Caldwell did not laugh when he said, the handwriting changes midway through. He added, the later pages look like someone copying from an older original, not Josephine's neat script. I think she found a diary. Those pages, still preserved under glass, read less like confession and more like instruction. Ratio, boiling times, the impact of fat content on absorption speed, notes on masking bitterness with almond and citrus, and scattered between the lines as if to humanize the horror, personal fragments. He sleeps poorly now. The child kicks at dusk. If we fail, the river will take us anyway. There are those who doubt the page's authenticity. Some argue they are forgeries, crafted by later hands hungry for sensational history. Others counter with handwriting analysis. The script matches an 1840s kitchen ledger. Chemical notations, while rudimentary, align with period-accurate knowledge imported from Europe. No one has disproven them, but neither has anyone dared run the final test, reproducing the formula in a controlled setting. Ethics boards, understandably, will not entertain. Meanwhile, oral histories complicate the picture. In the Tremor district, an old woman interviewed in 1983 claimed her great-grandmother had been the girl who walked away from the Bogards' death house. When pressed for details, she wept and said only she wanted peace, but the city never let her have it. Every October, men came asking questions, some polite, some not. She kept moving until she couldn't anymore. They buried her without a name in Opelousas. I've seen the stone. No one found such a stone. Opelousas has many graves, many unmarked, but something in the cadence of the woman's story felt less like invention than exhaustion, the kind of truth told not for reward, but for relief. The city itself remains a palimpsest of these memories. Beneath every renovation, a trace. Contractors tearing up old foundations in the former Bogard lot in 1991 reported finding bricks blackened not by fire but by what the lab identified as long-term chemical corrosion consistent with acidic compound. No city official explained why soil beneath a dining room would eat through brick. The report was filed, then quietly removed from the public record within the month. And there is the matter of the missing ladle. It has become almost mythic among collectors. A silver serving piece, engraved with the Bogard crest, last logged in an 1841 household inventory, never auctioned, never seen again. In 2004, a private estate sale in Baton Rouge listed an unmarked, 9 silver ladle, unusually heavy, with faint discoloration in bowl. The buyer, a physician with an interest in medical curios, submitted a shaving of the metal for analysis. Traces of arsenic clung stubbornly to the groove, where handle met bowl, locked there by time, by fat, by history's own corrosive patience. He returned it to its case, and according to his widow, refused to touch it again. By the spring of 2011, the Bogard story had ceased to be a rumor. It had become a problem. Developers wanted the lot. The city wanted the tax revenue. Preservationists wanted dignity for whatever lay beneath it. And in the midst of it all, a graduate seminar at Tulane, Medical Catastrophes of the Antebellum South, had assigned the Lemoine Caldwell files as a capstone project. The seminar met in a windowless room in the basement of the Howard Tilton Library. Its 20 students were too young to feel fear as they read. They were hungry, academic, gleeful in that morbid way only scholars can be. They mapped symptoms against exposure times. They debated the metabolic implications of citrus mask. They built models of dose weight to body size, guessing which guest died first, who suffered longest, and why. It should have stayed theoretical, but one of them, not reckless, just curious,
decided to pull municipal permits to see whether soil cores had ever been taken from the Bogard site. The answer was yes, 5 times, in 5 different decades, for 5 unrelated projects. Each set of results had been filed, then pulled into restricted access within months. There were no explanations attached, only a stamp, internal request clearance. A public records request forced 2 of the old reports back into daylight. Both carried the same oblique notation in the chemical analysis section: elevated levels of heavy metals inconsistent with baseline geologic strata. Neither report dared use the word arsenic, neither ruled it out. Within weeks, 3 of the students withdrew from the course. 1 switched majors entirely. The professor, a veteran of controversial research, warned the remaining class to proceed with caution, not for legal reasons, but for personal safety. This city, he said quietly, has a memory longer than its streets. Some wounds bleed backward. That summer, construction began on a boutique hotel planned for the corner lot adjacent to the old Bogard tract. Within 3 weeks, 3 workers fell ill, non-fatal, violent gastrointestinal distress, numb extremities, headaches, described as like being struck with hammers made of light. Lab work showed no contagion, no foodborne culprit. OSHA wrote it up as possible environmental exposure. Quiet settlements followed. Then came the night security guard. His body was found slumped against a locked service door, eyes open, mouth flecked with foam. Autopsy was inconclusive. The coroner's handwritten note, later leaked, read only cardiac event, unclassifiable etiology. His widow left the city 2 days after burial. The hotel never opened. By fall, interest in the story surged online. Threads on obscure forums argued about dosage half-lives, arsenic binding to soil, whether enough remained active to harm anyone a century later. One user posted photographs of a handwritten recipe, claiming it came from a private collection, descended from a woman who once worked in that kitchen. The handwriting matched neither Violet's ledger nor Josephine's note. The language, though, rang authentic: 1 spoon for silence, 2 for sleep, 3 for the crossing. The post was deleted within hours. Screenshots circulated anyway. By 2013, the Archdiocese weighed in. Without official announcement, priests performed a low-visibility blessing of the site, quietly witnessed by a handful of parishioners. Some say it was exorcism, some say it was apology. The city denied knowledge. The newspapers did not cover it, but neighbors reported that, for several weeks after, the air at the park smelled faintly of bitter almonds when the wind shifted east. It is easy to mistake pattern for paranoia. It is harder when the pattern cuts across centuries. Archives, ledgers, personal diaries, municipal soil reports, and the bodies of men who never knew the name Bogard yet died in its shadow. The last entry in Caldwell's private correspondence, dated 2 months before his sudden stroke in 1987, now reads like prophecy. If you study this long enough, it begins to behave like a living thing. It does not want to be known, or perhaps it wants to be known only by those willing to pay the cost of knowing. I sometimes think I hear her at night, not words, but the hush before words, like a kitchen gone still just before the knife meets the board. Whatever justice she meant, it has outlived her body. It moves without her now. It was the archivist, not the historian, who broke the silence. In March of 2019, a quiet man named René Dupré, mid-50s, methodical, a professional of paper and dust, was tasked with cataloging the personal correspondences of the late Dr. Harold Brousseau, a respected physician and quiet collector of local curiosities. The Brousseau family had donated 5 boxes. 4 were harmless: church rosters, dinner invitations, faded photographs. The 5th was not. Inside it lay a bound folio, leather warped, its clasp corroded. On the spine, in a hand both elegant and hurried, someone had written, "Recettes medicinales, N.O." Inside, not medicine, not exactly. The first pages were culinary sauces, preserves, the handwriting of a kitchen long since dismantled. But as the folio progressed, the ratios shifted. Sugar became measurement, butter became reagent. Instructions gave way to cautions. Do not inhale over open heat. The bitter must be masked at once or the tongue will betray it. If the liver swells, do not proceed. The archivist read, line by line, until he reached a chart, crude yet unmistakable, mapping dosage to weight, age, sex, and something coded proximity of blood. In the margin, test on twins inconclusive, results not symmetrical. Further observation required. Rene, a man who did not believe in curses, closed the folio and requested an unscheduled day off. The Brosseau family wanted discretion. Tulane wanted proof. The city wanted silence. For 3 months, the folio moved between quiet hands. Legal, medical, ecclesiastical. No one claimed ownership. No one claimed fraud. Too many details matched too many archives already under lock. It was during that window that a pattern, once whispered, became a map. The recipe was not a single poison. It was a sweet, modular, precise, tuned to exploit what medicine, in 1841, had not yet named, but what genetics now described with clinical ease: heritable enzyme deficiencies, common to a narrow set of Creole bloodline, not enough to kill outright under ordinary circumstances, but when folded into dishes chosen for their fat and acid content, the combination delivered organ failure that mimicked fever, fast, multi-system, untreatable. And then someone noticed the ledger's quietest entry, a brief, easily overlooked remark: bloodlines propagate, adjustments must follow the tree. It was dated 6 months after the dinner. Scholars argued in conference rooms about whether the note implied further poisonings, targeted, invisible, folded into everyday meals across the city in the months after the mansion fell silent. No death certificates link neatly, but genealogical charts, when overlaid with municipal death spikes in specific parishes, drew curves that made stomachs tighten: sudden collapses at weddings, unexplained fevers at baptisms, whole households struck by what coroners then called visitation of Providence. It is one thing to imagine vengeance contained to a night, to a table, to 13 names in a single house. It is another to face the possibility, whispered only behind closed doors, that the night was the signal, not the sum, that the recipes were meant not just to avenge, but to prove. Rene tried to resign. He wrote in his formal notice that his work had ceased to be archival and had become participatory. Tulane refused, offering instead indefinite leave. He left anyway. His replacement lasted 6 weeks before requesting transfer. By autumn, a private briefing circulated among city officials, quietly warning against aggressive redevelopment of properties in a 4-block radius around the former Bogard tract. The language was bureaucratic, but the subtext was naked fear: disturb nothing, test nothing, dig nowhere. And then came the funeral, October 12, 2019. A prominent New Orleans family, unrelated by name to the Bogards, but tangled distantly by marriage through 2 centuries, gathered for burial at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. The patriarch had died suddenly, inexplicably, at 62. The reception after was catered. The dishes were modern, the kitchen inspected, the ingredients sourced fresh. 47 guests ate. By midnight, 19 were in hospital. 5 were dead by morning. Autopsies yielded nothing useful. Toxicologists tested for every modern compound. None matched. Blood work showed organ failure with no discernible trigger. Doctors described it as catastrophic metabolic cascade. The press called it a mystery. Old families called it a reckoning. Behind closed doors, city officials invoked an older, unscientific word: inherited. The funeral cluster was supposed to be a fluke. At least, that's what the health department said in its initial briefing. An unfortunate confluence of food sensitivities, stress-induced arrhythmias, and a not yet identified contaminant in imported citrus. It was a comfortable lie, elegant in its uselessness. Behind that polished reassurance, private calls and encrypted messages spun like insects around a lamp. The families knew, not because they were told, but because bloodlines carry more than resemblance. They had seen the name in their own papers, faint, at the edge of pedigree charts, sometimes crossed out, sometimes annotated in a hand too shaky to decipher. They had heard whispers at Christmas tables when the wine was too generous. They had been taught without explanation to avoid certain gatherings, certain marriages, certain streets in certain months. Now the warnings had come due. A month later, the city hosted a gala, heritage fundraiser, museum-sponsored, invitation only. The food was vetted twice, the catering team run through background checks, the venue sterilized by a contractor whose paperwork had paperwork. The evening was uneventful. Speeches were made, toasts offered, artifacts displayed under glass. It wasn't until the next morning that the calls began. Not dozens, hundreds. Spasms, vomiting, vision distortion, hearts misfiring like faulty engines. 86 hospitalizations, 12 deaths, all from guests with ancestral ties to a single parish. Orleans, 1841. By the third day, the CDC was on site. By the fifth, they had nothing. Every test returned negative. No bacteria, no viral strain, no environmental toxin, no common dish that contained a pathogen. It was as though the bodies themselves had decided, in unison, to abandon function. An old Jesuit, called in not by authority but by desperation, said quietly in a side office, "Some prayers do not reach heaven, some reach only what waits underneath." The room fell silent. No one laughed. Not anymore. The insurance companies refused coverage under an obscure clause about unforeseeable hereditary event. Attorneys combed through death certificates from the last 178 years, compiling a list of incidents too strange, too clustered, too similar to dismiss as random variants. The pattern became a web. The web pointed not to food, not to air, but to lineage. By winter, private security details shadowed descendants like ghostly bodyguards. Genealogists were paid fortunes to sever paper trails, to unname children, to falsify birth dates, to smudge the ink of blood itself. Some families left the city entirely, abandoning houses older than the country, convinced that distance could break the chain. Others stayed too proud or too numb to run, and held dinners anyway, as if defiance could immunize the blood. Then came the March incident. Quiet, public, undeniable. A music festival, riverfront, high attendance, all ages, food trucks, beer tents, nothing elaborate. Among the crowd, by every later reconstruction, were at least 14 individuals, whose names appeared, however faintly, on the Bogard inheritance grid. 4 collapsed within the hour. 3 never made it to the ambulance. The others died by nightfall. No one else, not a single unrelated guest, reported more than a mild stomachache. The city panicked in a way cities never admit. Events were cancelled. Outdoor gatherings thinned to rumor. Every kitchen of standing heritage houses was stripped down to its boards. Some were burned outright. What terrified officials most was not the deaths, though the deaths were bad enough. It was the latency. No shared dish, no identifiable trigger, no discernible origin. Nothing introduced at the festival, nothing consumed on site, nothing but presence and ancestry. By April, the working theory was whispered in conference calls, never written. The code was never poison. The code was instruction. A series of practices, preserved in kitchens, passed like inheritance, applied not in hatred, but in habit. A recipe without a name, prepared without question, folded into culture like salt into dough. What Violet began as vengeance, had calcified into ritual, not worshipped, not spoken, simply done, out of pattern, out of unexamined fidelity. Its original fury forgotten, its function intact. The reckoning then was not a haunting, it was housekeeping.